Hi, thanks for watching. So part 2 today of Exclusivism, Inclusivism, Pluralism. So this is Christianity and Migration and Pluralism is the name of the topic. This is the second half of the topic that I'm going to take you through today. Now, just a little word of warning with this one. My slides are quite wordy because there's a lot to say on these issues and it can get a little bit technical. So as usual, if you feel like it's going too fast, just pause, make your own notes, get comfortable with it and familiar with it, go at your own pace. That's obviously absolutely fine. Okay, and don't forget, if you haven't had a look at part 1, check that out as well. Okay. So let's start with this idea of exclusivism that we need to know about. So exclusivism, the clue's in the name really. It's the idea that there is only one right way of doing things. There is only one right religion. So an exclusivist would argue that their religion is the only one that can be true. And even if other religions have stuff in common with your true faith, it's wrong because it isn't quite the true faith. So you get quite a lot of exclusivism in some, not all, but some more evangelical groups of Christians. So it's quite hard to pinpoint exactly where exclusivists are, but they tend to be on the kind of evangelical, almost fundamentalist wing of Christianity. So they believe that the goal of human life is to be saved, salvation from sin, and be rewarded with eternal life in heaven. But they believe that there's only one way to get there. So you may remember this as justification by faith. So it's only through acceptance of Jesus as Saviour that someone can be saved. There's no other way to do it. Therefore, if you believe that there's another way to be saved, you're not correct, you're wrong. And exclusivists take their backing from various passages in the Bible, which we're going to have a look at, but this is the really important one because you can be asked about this on the exam. John 14:6, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me. So this is in John's Gospel, but it's quoting Jesus. This is Jesus saying, nobody comes to the Father except through me. So for exclusivists, that totally backs up what they believe. Let's look at that quote in a bit more depth. So it's making it really clear that the only way to be saved is through Christ, through having a relationship with Christ, through accepting him as Saviour. There might be a little bit of wiggle room. Some Christians accept that there might be one or two exceptions, which I've put here. What if you die before you're old enough to have a relationship with Christ? What if you live somewhere where you never encounter the Christian message? That's surely not your fault. But it's quite sweeping, really. For those who believe that the only way to be saved is through a relationship with Christ, they would say that evangelism becomes a major priority because you have to reach everyone. You have to get the message of Jesus to everybody because it's the only way to save them from being condemned to hell. Now, John 14:6 is the one that you need to know for the exam, so please memorise that. There's a few more here which can be given to support exclusivism. Now, you can't be asked these, but if you learn them, it might help you if you were called upon to write about this in the exam. So there's another one from John, one from Romans, so that's a bit of St. Paul saying, for everyone who calls upon the name of the Lord will be saved, implying that those who don't won't be saved. And a similar sentiment coming across there in Acts chapter 4. So the implications of exclusivism are quite powerful, if that's the right word. If the exclusivists are right, then Christianity is right and all other truth claims are wrong. Now, there's a question over what that needs to look like. To be saved, does a person need to be kind of loud and proud about their Christianity, or can they kind of have that faith privately and will that be enough? People have different views about that, but we probably don't have to get into that too much. But for Christians who believe in exclusivism, it's a very, very central belief because their argument is this: if there are lots of ways to live life that can lead to salvation, what was the point of Jesus dying on the cross? What was the point of that sacrifice? if ultimately we can get to heaven in all sorts of other ways, why did he have to do that? For them, it makes no sense. But there's some problems with exclusivism. And one of them is actually to do with God's omnipotence. So exclusivists say that people can only be saved through the channel of their Christian faith. But if God is omnipotent, he can do whatever he wants. He can save whoever he wants. It's up to him who is saved, not up to us. And to say that there's only one way that God could save people seems to be putting limits on God that shouldn't be there. The second point here, the Bible does have bits supporting exclusivism, particularly the John 14:6, but this binds God to a particular interpretation of Scripture. That can be a little bit dangerous to do, because you've probably studied the Bible enough to know that for almost every bit of text we read, there's more than one interpretation. So exclusivism is making quite a big call there by claiming that it knows exactly what the Bible is saying. And individual people believe that they do know exactly what the Bible is saying because it speaks to them on a deeply personal level. But it's hard to apply that universally. The biblical problems get bigger if you're someone who's interested in this idea of editing. So the Gospels may have undergone quite extensive editing. John's Gospel in particular was the last one to be written. So we know that somebody wrote down that Jesus said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." We know that that got written down, but that's not the same as saying we know he said it. So that's worth considering. And the final problem is Jesus doesn't seem to be an exclusivist himself. He's very inclusive in his dealings with people. He reaches out to those of other faiths. So this doesn't seem to support the idea that he only comes for those who accepted him. He only comes for those who agreed with him. He spent a lot of time reaching out to people who perhaps weren't his natural allies. So let's move on and look at inclusivism. Now, there's different understandings of inclusivism, and they can't ask you about this, but it's worth just knowing so that you're aware of the flexibilities in it. So you get closed inclusivism. This is still the view that there's one right religion, but it's saying other religions have some aspects of this truth. So it's introducing some overlap. And then open inclusivism is saying that one religion, or possibly one denomination, has a better grasp of the truth than others, but all religions have got truthful things to say, valuable things to say, so it's possible to embrace that common ground. And Pope John the 23rd said this: "What unites us is much greater than what divides us," which makes many Catholics at least try to take an inclusivist view of other Christian denominations, focusing on the uniting stuff rather than the dividing stuff. Now, there's stuff in the Bible to support inclusivism as well. So I've got two quotes here, one from Acts, one from Romans. And the key takeaway, I think, from both these quotes is this idea that God does not show favoritism. So this is claiming that God doesn't have chosen people who will be saved. God doesn't have favorites, essentially. And in the Romans, I think where it says first for the Jew, then for the Gentile, that's not saying Jews are better than Gentiles. I think it can be interpreted to say there will be trouble and distress for every human being who does evil. I mean you, and I also mean you. So it's being inclusive. It's saying this is coming for everybody. So if you get it wrong, there'll be trouble for everybody. If you follow God, there will be good for everybody. Much more inclusive. Again, this is kind of a bit of bonus content, but Karl Barth weighed in on this. He took an inclusivist view because he thought actually all religion was ineffective. What he meant by that was that it's entirely up to God what happens. God's grace is given to everyone. God is absolutely sovereign, and Jesus' death and resurrection put everybody under the judgment of God. So that event changed the world. But what Barth is saying is that individual kind of professions of faith or individual acts of worship are completely ineffective. nothing is going to make any difference to God, because God will save you if God is going to save you. There's nothing you can do to influence that. Now, this is an inclusivist view, but it's a bit of an unconventional inclusivist view. You can go ahead and read a little bit more about Barth if you're interested, or if you want to take it further, but you can't get a question on him in the exam. So if you're finding this a little bit tricky, don't worry, you can just park this bit. The guy that you do need to know about, however, is Karl Rahner, because he can come up in questions. So Rahner came up with this idea of anonymous Christians as an inclusivist kind of stance. So he believed that people who weren't Christians, who had not lived a Christian life, could still be saved, because God has the power to do that. And his criteria for that was to say, just because you might not have heard the message of Jesus or listened to the message of Jesus or lived your life as a Christian, doesn't mean that it's not possible for you to live a good life. So if you've been an atheist or a Hindu or a Muslim or whatever background you come from, if you've lived a life in line with the teachings of Christianity, so you've been a good person, you've taken care of others, you might as well have been a Christian. So this is why he calls them anonymous Christians. So he says that the power of God is sufficient to overcome the limited stupidity and evil-mindedness of men. What's he saying there? Is he implying that non-Christians are stupid and evil-minded, but that God saves them anyway? Or is he more kind of saying that God's love is more powerful than anything we might get wrong in our lives? It's not clear. But here's a little bit more on it. He's not saying everyone is saved by God, but he's saying everyone can be saved by God if they live a life of good works. So this tracks with the Catholic belief in justification by works, and Rahner was a Catholic. He doesn't think all religions are the same. He doesn't think they're all necessarily equally good, but he thinks they should explore the things they have in common and find that actually if the morality is similar, then it doesn't terribly matter, because you might as well have been a Christian. So Rahner's still Catholic, he's still Christian, he's still arguing that Christianity is the right religion, but people of all faiths and none can be saved if they've lived the life of what he would call an anonymous Christian. Not everybody likes this, so here are your criticisms, here are your weaknesses of it. First of all, exclusivists aren't having it because they don't accept that other views or other faiths lead to salvation. So they think that straight away Rahner is wrong about that, and that you do have to have been a Christian. Hick, who we're coming back to in a minute, doesn't like this because he finds it a bit patronising. He thinks it's a bit insulting to put different beliefs in the context of Christianity, because it just automatically diminishes these beliefs. It's like saying to a Hindu, well, you know, yes, you were a Hindu only because you didn't know any better. You might as well have been a Christian. Hick doesn't like that, and you'll see why when we get on to look at Hick's views. And also, why does Christianity have to be the right religion? Why not say that a Christian is simply an anonymous Hindu? Rahner is coming from a point of believing that Christianity is the right religion, but that is just a belief. Right, so this next bit, and again, I apologise for how wordy it is, but I've simplified this right down from the textbook. How Christians view each other. You probably know by now from studying Christianity that there's huge diversity within Christianity. And when those diverse groups work together, that's what we call ecumenism, or ecumenical is the kind of adjective form of it. So Christians try to do this. There is a big ecumenical movement. There's something called the World Council of Churches, but not all churches are full members, and the Catholic Church is not a full member. That's because the Catholic Church has got certain teachings and doctrines that it sees as absolutely non-negotiable. So while the Church of England, say, has moved on quite a lot of things over the years, so it's moved on women priests, it's moving potentially on homosexuality, LGBT people, and blessing a gay marriage. The Catholic Church is not prepared to move on those things. So dialogue's encouraged, but compromise is not. That's why the Catholic Church can't get on the same page with some other Christian denominations. You also get evangelical groups who don't really participate in this because they're exclusivists. They say, well, you know, it doesn't matter all these differences. If you don't make a personal commitment to Christ, you will not be saved. Now, the Church of England is somewhere in between, because the Church of England is a very broad church. Lots of good work goes on, lots of ecumenical work, lots of cross-denominational work, and the Church doesn't tend to like to exclude other Christians from the possibility of salvation. So the Church of England doesn't tend to have strongly exclusivist views. It tends to be much more inclusivist. Okay, let's move on to pluralism. So this is Hick, and it helps here to remember a little bit what Hick said about the problem of evil, his theodicy. He believes in universal salvation. In other words, everybody eventually gets to heaven. It may take lots of lifetimes, but we do get there in the end. So universal salvation. So because of that, he rejects exclusivism. He doesn't like the idea that there's one correct religion. And he goes further and says, well, if we're all saved in the end, then there can't be a hell. He doesn't like the idea of hell. It's incompatible with the idea of a loving God. A loving God, in Hick's view, would not send anyone to hell. So he thinks to get your head around this debate, you have to ask what religion actually is. And there's a nice quote from Hick here, which is worth knowing. The transformation of human existence from self-centeredness to reality-centeredness. So it's about being on a journey. It's about growing, changing, becoming the best version of yourself. Essentially, the process of soul making, which he talks about in his theodicy. So Hick therefore sees the key purpose of religion as this journey of self-transformation. Now, if it's about that, then it doesn't need to be about specific moments in history or specific supernatural truth claims. If they help you on your journey, then great, but we don't have to hang on to them. And therefore for Hick, if this is what religion is about, the differences and little incompatibilities between religions don't really matter. They become a little bit irrelevant. So a little bit more on his universalism. This is the idea that God saves everyone. We will all get to a point where we can be saved. It takes some longer than others. This is a very nice idea, but it's very radical. And if we're talking about there being no hell and there being multiple lifetimes to perfect your soul, we're already quite a long way away from what Christianity teaches. And if Hick is right, then it means that teachings such as the parable of the sheep and the goats, which is all about heaven and hell, it means that they must be wrong. So Christians are quite sceptical about Hick's views. As we see here, it's been widely rejected. Firstly, his view of no significant differences. It's tough to argue that when you've got groups such as Islamic State identifying as religious and carrying out atrocities. You can't really say, well, that's just a different interpretation of religion, it's equally valid. Hick's view doesn't work with many religious claims. Islam, Judaism, particularly, depend on very specific truth claims about the nature of God. So they believe that certain things about God are true, other things are not true. So they can't really get on board with Hick's view that all religions are ultimately on the same path. Christians tend to reject Hick because he's so far away from mainstream Christian teachings. And many religious believers of all backgrounds reject Hick's central point because they don't think religion is about self-transformation. They don't think it is about soul-making. They think it's about finding the truth, and there can only be one truth. So again, we're sort of back to the exclusivist view there. So it's quite tough to defend Hick from the point of view of making it work with religion. But that doesn't mean there's no value to what he says. what his ideas can encourage people to do is think harder about what religions have in common, think hard about what differences are religious and what differences are cultural, because actually there can be more unity than maybe we realise. Hick's views can be very helpful in moving interfaith dialogue forwards, and you don't have to accept everything he says for this to be doable. And the point about self-transformation, he may have a good point about this. Liberal forms of Christianity would probably agree. Buddhism certainly would agree. Self-transformation, becoming better, becoming more perfected, moving towards the true image of God. That bit's not too controversial for many people, so that may have value. Okay, last bit, issues of freedom of religious expression. So again, exclusivists may want limits on freedom of expression because they strongly believe that they are right, and because they are right, others should not be able to speak out against it. That's a problematic view, as you can probably figure out, because it basically means they want freedom of expression for themselves but not for other people. That's iffy. And it would be probably in breach of the 2010 Equality Act. Now, this is UK law. It actively promotes freedom of religious expression. But the Equality Act can lead to some tricky situations when two protected views come into conflict with each other. So let's look at some examples. Now, this is from quite a long time ago now. This is from 2010, the year that the Equality Act became law. And it was a Christian B&B owner who turned away a gay couple because she didn't think it was right for two men to stay in a double room together due to her Christian beliefs. This case went to court, and the court found in favour of the gay couple. The court found that they had been discriminated against. So even though the lady who owned the B&B felt that this was her right to refuse them a room, it was her freedom of expression, the court didn't agree. So that sort of established a principle that you're allowed freedom of expression as long as it doesn't then rob somebody else of their rights. But there was a case in the USA where it went the other way, where a baker refused to make a cake for a gay wedding and a court ruling went in favour of the baker. Now, the USA and Britain have different laws. That's important to know. But these cases are just indicative of how sometimes religious freedom bumps up against other sorts of rights. Probably the easiest one to talk about in exams is the example of wearing of religious symbols. So two cases that are in the textbook. There was an employee of British Airways who wanted to wear a little cross. There was one on I think she wanted to wear a lapel pin badge on her uniform or wear a small cross necklace. She'd always worn it, but then BA had a bit of a rebrand and they said it was not in keeping with their corporate image. They didn't want her to wear it. It might alienate people. She won her case because the tribunal ruled that this was just a small piece of religious jewellery expressing her religious identity, hurting no one. NHS nurse was in a similar situation. She'd worn her cross at work for years, but then new research came to light showing how disease could be transmitted in hospitals through jewellery, so it became an infection control risk. So she was no longer allowed to wear her cross. She appealed that decision and lost because there was a clear sense in that case that it was preventing her doing her job properly because it could be seen as an infection control risk. So there's a general principle that key beliefs must be allowed to be expressed, but it's not required for a Christian to wear a cross. So not allowing it might not be seen as a restriction on their religious freedom. If you stop someone from going to church, if you stop someone from praying, that might be a much, much, much bigger deal. But wearing of religious symbols, these are just some examples. We're only scratching the surface here. But the kind of principles that we're dealing with are, generally speaking, it should be allowed if it's practically possible. But if it's not practically possible, for instance, because you're a nurse, then it's not a restriction of your religious freedom to tell you that you can't wear your cross in a hospital. Right, nearly there. I just want to leave you with a little dialogues question to think about. Now, you may want to take this one away and plan it. You may want to just, you may want to write it in full as part of your revision. But this was a question that I thought was a possible one that could come up. Inclusivism is the only reasonable approach for Christians to take in modern Britain. Now, if this did come up, it would be a philosophy dialogues. So when you see the word reasonable, that kind of unlocks quite a lot of philosophical arguments for you. A good way into this would be to think, well, are any religious beliefs reasonable? Can any religious beliefs be taken seriously by philosophy and by science? If you agree that there is only one way to be saved, surely exclusivism is the only reasonable approach. You can explore all this. Remember, with dialogues, it can be very, very broad. There's lots and lots of ways through it. It's very much a choose your own adventure situation. So I'll leave you with that one to think about. Sorry, that one was a bit long. Thank you very much for watching. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you soon.